And joining me live now is independent economist and founder of Corinna Economic Advisory, Saul Eslake. Saul, Happy New Year, and thank you for coming on Sky News. I want to ask you firstly about this reduction in the price of some medicine.
Well, yes, that's probably the most significant change affecting a larger group of people of all the things that Keisha summarised just then. This is the second reduction in the price that most people pay for prescribed medicines under this government, and it's a fairly significant fall from over $31 to $25 per script. Of course, people on pensions or with healthcare cards will still have their payment capped at $7.70. There'll be no indexation of that, as there has traditionally been in the past this year and for at least the next 2 years. So the government's delivering here on its promise of cheaper medicines. There are other changes, of course, as Keisha's summary just mentioned, that will adversely impact some people, in particular electricity consumers and people who want to buy a new passport to travel overseas.
So on that, why are we seeing an increase in passport fees? So many of us are hoping to get overseas and do a bit of travel on the back of that COVID period. So why the change here?
Well, the increase that you mentioned of $10 to $422 is an increase of 2.5%. So that's slightly less than the likely inflation rate over the course of 2025. We'll get the final figure for 2025 at the end of January, but that follows an increase of 23% in the passport fee in 2024, which Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, described in announcing it as a modest increase. I don't think anybody else would describe an increase in anything of over 20% as modest, but that was the term he used for it. It was a revenue-raising measure. Australia now has the most expensive passports in the world. They're not the most powerful passports in the world in terms of the number of countries that an Australian passport will get you into. That title belongs to Singapore, and even New Zealand's passport, which is a lot cheaper than Australia's, will get you into more countries without a visa than an Australian passport will. It is just simply a revenue-raising measure, and since the number of Australians who travel overseas is a small proportion of the population, the government presumably thinks that it can do this without any significant electoral cost. After all, it lasts for 10 years, and so people have probably forgotten what they paid for it when the last time they renewed it. It's annoying, but it's probably not going to cause any electoral problems for the government. There might be more resistance to the termination of the electricity bill rebate, although I think, as the Governor of the Reserve Bank said when it was announced in December, that was the right decision for the government to have taken.
It is one of those sneaky increases, isn't it? You also mentioned their energy. So we know up until this point, Australian households and some small businesses, some households too, have been able to receive this rebate, energy bill rebate of up to $150. But that's now coming to an end. This is going to be a really difficult time for people.
Well, it will be for some people. But it's important to, I think, note that the context is different today from what it was when these electricity bill rebate schemes were first introduced back in 2023 and 2024. Back then, overall inflation was rising by more than 6%. Today, it's higher than we would like at just over 3%, but it's roughly half what it was at its peak. Wages are now rising at a faster rate than inflation, which they weren't 2 or 3 years ago when these rebates were introduced. And both income tax and interest rates have come down some since the middle of last year, or since the middle of 2026 and 2025 in the case of the tax cuts. So people are better able, in most instances, to cope with higher electricity prices than they were when these schemes were introduced. And these schemes were, as many others have pointed out, poorly targeted. I mean, I got one, even though I don't need assistance from the government to pay higher electricity prices. In fact, I got two because for historical reasons, there are 2 meters on my property, and, I shouldn't have been getting that. So I think the government has made the right decision to terminate those schemes, and, the Governor of the Reserve Bank endorsed that decision as well.
And hopefully that brings down inflation too. We've also going to be seeing increases in welfare payments and an expansion of childcare subsidies.
That's right. As you mentioned, or as Keisha mentioned, a range of welfare payments, including youth allowance, are increased in line with inflation. Pensions are usually increased in line with inflation in March and September, so there'll be an increase for them later this year and again in the second half of this year. And from, I think, 5 days hence, almost everyone earning a family income of less than about 530,000 who have preschool children will be able to access at least 3 days a week of free childcare. That was another of the government's election promises on which it's delivering. Now, all of these promises, including one I mentioned before about the reduction in cheaper medicines, these are expensive. They will cost money. And it's one of the reasons why the government is, again, running budget deficits. And as we learnt in the mid-year economic and fiscal outlook released just before Christmas, the federal government will be running deficits at least through 2035-36, which is a long way away.
And just before we let you go, this is some news that Bob Catter will be very happy about. He's been a big advocate of this. He says cash is king. It'll be mandatory for retailers who sell groceries and fuel to accept cash.
Up to $500, and I think if you're spending more than $500 in a single instance on food or groceries, well, a credit card is probably the best way of, or a direct debit card is probably the best way of doing that, rather than carrying around scads of $50 or $100 notes. This will be of benefit for the declining but nonetheless significant minority of Australians who don't feel comfortable using more modern means of payment, typically older Australians. And so it's understandable that the government has introduced this mandate. Small businesses will be, as they are from lots of things, exempt from this requirement. So it's mainly directed at larger businesses. But I think those people who continue for various reasons to prefer to use cash will welcome this change too.
Saul Eslake, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me, and Happy New Year to you and your viewers as well.